Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on benchmarking methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. We'll give folks just another minute. Folks are filing in, so um, we'll start in about 30 seconds or so. All right, it's looking like we're getting toward critical mass here, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome again, everyone. I'm Andrew Logan with Ceres. I want to thank you all for joining us today for a webinar which will cover the highlights of our fourth annual report that benchmarks the greenhouse gas emissions of onshore oil and gas production in the U.S. This report is a partnership, a longstanding partnership between Ceres, Clean Air Task Force, and ERM. And we've been able to do this work with generous support from the Bank of America Foundation. So thanks to all of them. If you're here today, you probably know that methane has become an increasingly important area of focus for investors, for policymakers, for companies. And this report, as you'll hear today, helps explain why that is. There's tremendous variability in emissions between producers, and particularly between top and bottom quartile performance bands. And, what that means is that for many companies, there is considerable room for improvement in their emissions performance. Even just bringing all of the producers up to sort of the mean emissions level would be hugely impactful for the climate. And yet, as you'll hear today, over the years that we've been doing this analysis, the gap between leaders and laggards has actually gotten wider, to the point where there are now literal orders of magnitude difference between the emissions intensity of top and bottom quartile performers. And really, I think one has to conclude that for the poorest performers, those in the bottom quartile, high leak rates are in many ways a conscious choice. And so, we think that this analysis has implications for policymakers because it makes clear that there is tremendous room to reduce emissions in much of the sector. It's also important information for investors who can use it to determine which of their holdings have room to improve. I think it actually might be particularly useful for investors that have exposure to private equity funds, as many of the higher emitting companies are actually owned by private equity firms. And as well, you'll hear that the EPA data, while it has many challenges to it, also contains a lot of very helpful detail. So not only can an investor, essentially see who the leaders and laggards are, but you can see at some level, why that is so, why emissions differ from company to company. And then, of course, if you're joining us here today, you probably know that there's been a lot of debate and discussion about the best approach to measuring methane emissions, particularly the importance of increasing the amount of direct emissions measurement and the frequency of that measurement, as opposed to the sort of older approach of using emissions factors to estimate emissions. And so one of the things that I found particularly useful about this analysis, and that you'll hear about today, is to better understand both what the EPA data can tell us, and what it can't, essentially. So, without additional delay, let's get to our speakers. Today, you're going to be hearing from speakers representing all of the groups that partnered on this report. First, you're going to hear from Luke Helgren with ERM, who's initially going to speak to the methodology behind the report. Then Leslie Feldman from Clean Air Task Force will highlight some of the key findings. And then finally, we'll hand back to Luke to present the online data tool, which allows you to essentially generate your own report based on the company's basins and data slices that you're interested in. And then we'll save ample time for questions. We ask that you submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and just feel free to submit them as they occur to you, and we'll gather and address them after the presentations are done. So with that, I'm going to pass to Luke to get into the methodology.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to spend a few minutes going through the methodology before handing off to Leslie. There's a lot more insights and detail into the methodology in the report, but mainly wanted to highlight kind of the foundation of the report. So if we can go to the next slide. Um, this analysis is almost completely based off of EPA greenhouse gas reporting program data and specifically subpart W. So subpart W of the GHGRP is focused on petroleum and natural gas systems. So that system is kind of divided into 10 different segments. This analysis is exclusively focused on the onshore production segment of oil and gas production. So all hydrocarbon production in the report, both oil production and natural gas production, comes from GHGRP. A huge majority of the total greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, methane, N2O, come from GHGRP as well. Over 99% of emissions. The other less than 1% comes from some additional sources that are reflected within EPA's GHG inventory, which I'll get to in a little bit, but really wanted to focus on GHGRP primarily. So just to give a little context or a little more definition and scope to what is included. So not every single well in the country is necessarily included in the GHGRP. Any facility that emits over 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent in the reporting year is required to report. In the context of onshore production, a facility is defined as all production related equipment that is within one single production basin and is owned by a common holding company. So in other words, a holding company that owns production assets in a basin are aggregated up to the facility level that is then reported to the GHGRP. Once that, if a facility or a collection of assets in a basin meets that threshold of 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, then they report emissions and report those emissions based off of what types of sources they are, what type of pollutant it is, and ultimately develops the GHGRP that we're pulling from. So if we go to the next slide, the GHG inventory is really the only other emissions data set that we pull from. This is, again, less than 1% of total emissions that are reflected in the analysis, but they are inclusive and they do account for a couple of emission sources that GHGRP does not have. So these are minor sources, but we use a combination of activity data from GHGRP with emissions factors that are derived from GHG inventory to calculate or estimate company level and source specific emissions that we then add in to the GHGRP data to create a more comprehensive emissions inventory associated with each company. So going to the next slide, what we do with all this data, all these data, there are ultimately 23 different emission sources, 17 from GHGRP, 6 from the inventory, GHG inventory. And so we've categorized them or grouped them into 5 different categories to make it a little bit more manageable and to show kind of what are the primary emission sources responsible for total emissions. So the first here is vented emissions from processes and equipment. So these are intentional releases of natural gas, largely to release pressure. Some of the common sources of these vented emissions are from pneumatic devices and pumps, compressor blowdowns, seals, starts, acid gas removal units. And they're distinct from the following category, which is flared, just because the vented are intentional releases. Flared process and equipment emissions come from the combustion of gas that's captured from equipment and processes rather than vented. So these sources can include flare stacks, a lot of operations associated with wells, whether it's drilling, testing, completions, workovers, And so any gas that's captured associated with those processes is then combusted and largely made up of CO2. The next category is vented and flared emissions from associated gas. So associated gas is natural gas that's produced alongside oil, but then is vented or flared because of lack of infrastructure to collect the gas, or it's just not a product that the producer is interested in selling, and so they vent it or flare it. Fugitive emissions are unintentional releases of natural gas. So these are largely leaks, often from faulty, old, worn out equipment. So distinct from the vented emissions, these are unintentional. They're not supposed to happen. Some abnormal process conditions and super emitters are not included within the fugitive emissions reported within GHGRP, and that is a major emissions gap within the reporting program. But as I think Leslie may speak to a bit more with the update to subpart W, that may be changing in future years. The very last emission source is other combustion. So this has actually become one of the largest sources of emissions within the GHGRP, within subpart W, and within onshore production. So this is non-flared combustion. So it's largely CO2 emissions from diesel and gas engines that are used to either power equipment or provide electricity for certain sources to support oil and gas production. So ultimately, the two major sources are other combustion and vented emissions associated with equipment and processes. Going to the next slide, the last slide is kind of some of the baseline metrics that we're really looking at that are being used to benchmark companies against each other, and those are the intensity metrics. So we have two metrics throughout the report. One is really focused on the natural gas value chain, and so that's the methane intensity. And so we're using the NGSI, Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative protocol, and the calculation and equation associated with that intensity. And it's really focused on assigning methane emissions associated with natural gas production to reflect or characterize methane emissions from just the gas value chain, rather than something that's more comprehensive of the total hydrocarbon production. This is different than the waste emissions charge, the new EPA methane intensity metric that will be relevant for in MERP and how the waste emissions charge is ultimately implemented. And we will also get to that a little bit. The last piece before handing it over to Leslie is the more general emissions intensity metric that is inclusive of both oil production and natural gas production. This is the GHG intensity metric. So it's just total GHG emissions, CO2, methane, N2O, divided by total hydrocarbon production. So all oil and natural gas production normalized to a barrel of oil equivalent kind of gives the idea of what's the general GHG emissions intensity of total production. So with that, I will hand over to Leslie for some of the major takeaways this year and some of the trends that we're beginning to see.
Thank you, Luke. So yes, I'll talk about some of the key findings and conclusions of the benchmarking report. Next slide. But first, just a few considerations about the data. It is important to recognize that there is a gap between reported emissions and measured emissions. A big portion of this gap is the result of large release events, also sometimes called super emitters. So the reported emissions in this report are an underestimate of actual emissions, and also not all sources are always accurately captured in the reports. Nevertheless, these reported emissions provide a useful starting place to compare companies and their practices across the US. Next slide. So some of the key findings of the report. The reported methane emissions intensity of natural gas production and the greenhouse gas emission intensity of oil and gas varies dramatically across producers, with the highest emitting oil and gas companies having a methane emission intensity nearly 32 times that of the lowest emitting companies. And that's up from 26 times difference in the 2021 reported data. Emissions intensity can vary even between similarly sized operators in the same geographic area, according to the data, and it's largely due to different equipment choices and operational practices. Pneumatic controllers were the largest source of reported production segment methane emissions. And like Luke was saying, fuel combustion, including heaters and engines, was the largest source of reported CO2 emissions. In addition, venting and flaring are significant contributors in oil-heavy basins, and I'll show some of that in the figures in the slides to come. So this slide shows another breakdown of those emission source categories that Luke showed on his slide. You can see in the figure on the left all emissions, both methane and CO2. You can see that process and equipment vented and fugitive emissions are dominated by methane, while process and equipment flared, other combustion and associated gas venting and flaring are dominated by CO2 emissions. On the right, you can see a zoom in of just the process and equipment vented emissions, and you can see that those reported emissions are dominated by pneumatic devices and pneumatic pumps. Next slide. So I wanted to share some of the basin level results. There's always a lot more detail in the report itself. But here, this slide shows the top basins by amount of oil and gas production and their associated greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that the relationship between emissions and production is not always one-to-one. Some vary. There's quite a lot of variation among basins. And also the source of emissions is quite different. You could, in the Permian Basin, which is the highest production basin, the vast majority of emissions are CO2, whereas in the Appalachian Basin, CO2 and methane are roughly equivalent, at least when considering a 100-year GWP for methane. If you were to use a 20-year GWP for methane, methane, of course, would look much, much higher as well. Next slide. So here are those same basins, this time with emissions divided up between those 5 emission source categories. And you can see in different basins, combustion, venting emissions contributing a different amount to overall basin level emissions. In addition, that purple category, associated gas venting and flaring, is a significant contributor in some oil-heavy basins like the Permian in Texas and in New Mexico, and in the Williston Basin in North Dakota. Next slide. So combining all of that, as Luke showed those equations for calculating the methane and GHG intensity, combining all the production and emissions data, these are the average intensities for each basin, with the methane intensity on the left in purple and the greenhouse gas emissions on the right, also showing the breakdown in how much of that intensity is driven by the CO2 emissions versus the methane emissions in that basin. Next slide. So now I'll focus on some of the national company level results. This slide, taken from the report, shows the top 100 oil and gas producers in the US and their reported greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that for any company of interest to you, you can zoom in and see how their emissions compares to that of their peers. And on the next slide, combining that production data and the emissions data, this is the greenhouse gas intensity and the NGSI methane intensity for each of those top 100 companies. And here you can start to see what we're talking about when we talk about the variation among companies. Some companies have very low reported intensities. For other companies, the intensity is quite high. And we think it's very illustrative to take a look at these companies and try to, it's a starting point to understand, it's a starting point to see this variation. And then for any given company, there's always a lot more to dig in to understand what is driving the high or the low emission intensity. So next, a few of the national level trends. The data I presented up until now was just most recent 2022 data, but we do have the data reported to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program going back several years. In this slide, we show the trends for some of the key data points going back to 2015. So you can see natural gas production and overall hydrocarbon production has increased in that time period. In that time period, also reported methane emissions has decreased. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Greenhouse gas emissions overall increased to a peak in 2019 and have come down, and now they're roughly at the same level they were at the start of the time series. And as a result of all these changes, the methane intensity and the greenhouse gas intensity have fallen over the time period. Next slide. And here's that same time series broken out into those 5 emission source categories. You can see for the 2 methane heavy emission sources, vented and fugitive emissions have fallen, although there's still quite a ways. We believe there's still quite a lot more that can be done to reduce those emissions. You can see for the flared emission sources, flared and then associated gas venting and flaring, those reached a peak in 2019 and have come down somewhat, but are still at roughly equivalent levels to where they were at the beginning of the time series. And combustion emissions have continued to increase. Those emissions largely go with production. So as production increases, combustion at oil and gas production sites has gone up as well. Next slide. So now I just showed you a lot of data, and I hope you'll take a look at the report and dig into anything you're interested in. But I wanted to take a step back to talk a little bit about what has driven these emission trends that we've seen. There's a lot of different factors that have driven emissions changes over the time period. But we know that there have been the reported emissions levels and calculated emissions intensities must be viewed in the context of the broader regulatory landscape in the US. And compliance with these regulations has definitely led to some emission reductions. For example, each year as old wells are retired and new wells are drilled and reworked, a larger portion of the nation's reported oil and gas production has become subject to the 2016 Quad OA new and modified source rules. We also know that requirements for reduced emission completions have driven down emissions from well completions and workovers across the country. In addition, at these new and modified sources, operators have been prohibited from using high bleed pneumatic controllers, and instead have required to use lower emitting pneumatic controller options. And also at these new and modified sites, leak detection and repair requirements have been in place. And then finally, regulations that put limits on flaring volumes have been in place in some basins and states, and that has likely that might be part of what we're seeing in the flaring data in some of these basins. Next. However, that's all good news, but it's also difficult to separate the impact of regulatory compliance from a lot of other factors that are happening in the industry. A few examples of this: greenhouse gas reporting basins don't fall neatly into a single state. So if there are state level regulatory actions, it's not always possible to see that trend in the data. And like I said, the EPA regulations up until now have only covered new and modified sources. So it's not simple to separate those new sources within the data. Also, if a company owns an asset or sells an asset in a given basin, that might change the reported emissions. And that is not, not always straightforward to track in the data as well. And finally, a number of voluntary actions the companies have taken, either as part of voluntary programs or as early adoption of regulatory requirements. These sorts of actions may be showing up in the data as well as reduced emissions. But again, it's hard to separate these voluntary actions from regulatory compliance. Next slide. And finally, a number of new laws and regulations have been finalized and will soon be implemented across the US. Now, because these have only recently been finalized, we're not seeing the impact of them in the data yet, especially because the most recent data we have in this report is from 2022. But in the coming years, we should start to see the impact of these regulations for continuing to reduce emissions. Luke talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, which included the Methane Emission Reduction Program. Now, this required EPA to impose and collect an annual methane waste emission charge on methane emissions that exceed emission intensity thresholds. And this will first be imposed in 2025 and calculated using 2024 reporting year data. Also, as part of the Methane Emission Reduction Program, EPA recently finalized updates to Subpart W, which is the oil and gas part of the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. This won't directly have an impact on emission levels, but it will certainly have a large impact on the reported emissions that companies are submitting to EPA and that the public will be able to see. And finally, in March 2024, EPA finalized both updated new and modified source standards called Quad OB and existing source guidelines called Quad OC. Collectively, these are the Section 111 rules. For the new and modified source updates, those became effective in 2024 with a couple of years extra for some sources. And for the existing source standards, states have until 2026 to develop regulations and until 2029 to fully implement these state level standards. So over the next several years, we'll start to see more and more emission reductions as a result of the implementation of these regulations. And it's going to be especially important to make sure that states fully implement these existing source standards. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to Luke.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. All right, so I am going to share my screen. So I wanted to go through some of the interactive dashboards that provide a little bit more ability to slice and dice the data kind of however you want to. It's a little more flexible than the report, although the report is quite lengthy and has a lot of detail in it. These dashboards that I'm going to go through have just the ability to really dig into specific basins, companies within those basins, and just details associated with companies. So first, this is just the ERM landing page associated with the report and where all the interactive dashboards live. So the report can be downloaded here. Before getting to the dashboards, did want to note that an Excel file of a lot of the raw data that are kind of the underlying data associated with the interactive dashboards can be downloaded. So these data go back to 2015. It's a company level, basin level, source level data, and is in a spreadsheet form. If you want to just use the interactive dashboards for data, this is what this portion of the segment of this webinar is for. There are kind of three themes of dashboards on this web page that are of differing levels of granularity. The first theme is really focused on just company level data, some like total company level data. This is just looking at top 100 hydrocarbon producers from some of the primary metrics, so total production, total emissions. We have a few other dashboards I'll go through, but the following dashboards go in a little bit deeper. So they go into basin level, company by basin, and then really detailed company level data. So first, just to give kind of the broadest overview of this first theme, this company level data, the charts are really focused, again, as it updates, on these primary metrics that are reflected in the report. So we have top 100 producers by product. So we have natural gas production, we have oil production, we also have emissions, whether it's CO2, methane, or N2O associated with that production. We're in the process of fixing the x-axis to include all of the companies, but at the moment, if you hover your cursor over any given bar, it will show you some information associated with that bar, and you can see the company that the bar is representing and the hydrocarbon production associated with that producer. We can also look at just emissions by source, whether that's just a percentage or a share of total emissions, or kind of those emissions in CO2 equivalent form. So these are the same top 100 hydrocarbon producers, but we're looking at their emissions by those 5 source categories that are in the report. There is an ability to look at just GHGRP sources. So this would show the emissions associated with the 17 GHGRP sources, and then the non-GHGRP sources, which are really just the GHG inventory sources. Moving along, we can also look at these top 100 producers from their intensity metric. So their GHG intensity and their NGSI methane intensity, and see kind of how the different emissions associated with their production contributes to both the GHG intensity and then their methane intensity. The very last dashboard on this theme is not specific only to top 100 hydrocarbon producers. This is focused on top 100 producers from a given metric. So although a lot of the data within the report are primarily focused on the top 100 producers, there are typically around 300 producers that report to GHGRP. And so this is covering all of those 300 or so producers and ranking them by certain metrics. So in this case, we're looking at the top 100 emitters. So these are companies that are ordered by total GHG emissions. We can also look at the top methane emitters, the producers with the highest GHG intensity, the highest methane intensity, and other metrics as well. Moving down to kind of the next level of granularity is the basin specific information and the basin level dashboards. So the first set of dashboards within this theme is really nothing to do with companies. There's no company specific data within this. This is just looking at basin level information. So we have the bottom left shows the different GHGRP basins. Sorry, Tableau likes to just automatically refresh sometimes. So these are all the individual GHGRP basins, and you can see where those basins rank against each other. So the Permian Basin, is the largest hydrocarbon producing basin in the country that's reported to GHGRP, but kind of similar to the previous dashboard, you can look at the attributes associated with each bar to see kind of how these production basins rank against each other in terms of hydrocarbon production, total emissions, and then again, we can go through the different metrics or the different ways to look at emissions, whether that's by benchmarking categories of sources, those 5 sources, or GHGRP sources or GHG inventory sources. We can also look at the methane and GHGRP and the GHG intensity of the entire basin. We can also go a little deeper and look at companies within specific basins and look at the data associated with those companies within the basin only. So this is no longer company level total. This is just basin level company data. So you can choose any given production basin in any year back to 2015, and then look at the contribution to production associated with each producer in that basin. Same metrics can be viewed here. So we're looking right now at the top producers within the Permian Basin in 2022, the total emissions associated with that production, and consistent with other dashboards, we can also look at how these emissions look from a source perspective. So as you can see with a lot of the orange that corresponds with other combustion, a lot of other combustion emissions, but there's also a noticeable contribution from the purple bar in certain companies as we look through this middle chart or middle top chart, which is associated gas vented and flared. Within the Permian, if we go back a few years, we can see this contribution of associated gas vented and flared looking quite more significant. So this purple bar here grew from, if we look back to 2019, but these are the types of trends that you can start to visualize a little bit more easily within these interactive dashboards. Going down to the very last theme of dashboard, this is the company overview. So this is really getting kind of as detailed as we can get to at a company level. So the first few dashboards within this window are looking at a single company at a time and giving an overview of how that company operates and where it operates, and kind of how they rank against other producers in context of certain metrics. So Exxon was the top producer in 2022. That's why it's kind of the default producer here. It's operating in 13 production basins. You can see how much hydrocarbon production Exxon was responsible for within those 13 production basins. You can see gas production, total methane emissions, total GHG emissions, the different intensities, and then you can see their emissions by source. And so, as you can see, a majority of the source responsible for the most emissions in Exxon's case is vented emissions, with other combustion and associated gas coming right behind it. You can see some initial rankings of kind of how they are with regards to certain metrics. So they are the #1 hydrocarbon producer in 2022. They have the 6th most emissions, but when you start looking at intensities, they're either in the middle, kind of the middle ground of methane intensity, and one of the lower GHG intensities. We can also, as previous dashboards, look at these companies from the same metrics, the production, emissions, and then intensity, but just cut a different way. So in this case, we're now looking at Exxon production, or any company can be selected here, and the production and emissions associated with individual basins in which they operate. So you can see this from just the total production, the total emissions by basin, by company, by year, or you can see emissions intensity by basin, by year. So you can start to really dig into company-specific data and also company-specific trends. The last piece is two dashboards that are focused on comparing. This is just really giving a little bit easier method to compare companies and benchmark companies against each other directly. So this is right now just focused on the 2 top hydrocarbon producers within the GHGRP, but any selection of companies can be selected. So we have Exxon and Chesapeake as 1 and 2. So you can see those primary metrics compared against each other. So total production, total emissions, GHG intensity, methane intensity, associated with these 2 individual companies we're looking at a total company level, not broken down by basin. If we want to break down companies by basin and compare them, we can go to the very last dashboard, and see kind of how these companies compare against each other within specific basins. So the Permian Basin is the default basin here because it's the #1 hydrocarbon producing basin. The top producers within the Permian are Pioneer and Occidental, and so you can select however many companies you'd like to compare that are within the production basin, and compare against each other. And you can see some of those, you can visually see the charts, but you can also see some of the tabular data, and some of the rankings that are associated with these companies within those basins. So there's a lot here to go through. Effectively, every chart that's in the report can be replicated within these dashboards, and then a lot more granular data can be viewed and developed kind of through slicing and dicing some and the filters of these different dashboards. So with that, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Luke. And thank you, Leslie. That was a lot of information in a small amount of time. So appreciate the conciseness of it. As Letitia, I think, said in the chat, feel free to add questions to the queue using the Q&A sort of box at the bottom, should be the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before we get to that, I would just throw in a plug for everyone to sort of spend even just a couple of minutes with the online tool that Luke just took us through. I mean, it looks maybe overwhelming, in this sort of quick tour, but it's incredibly intuitive, and flexible. And so, I think if you spend a few minutes in there, you'll just see kind of how powerful it can be. If you have an engagement coming up with a particular company, for example, just going through that company dashboard and sort of seeing where emissions are coming from and what the trends have been over time and how they compare to their peers and how their own emissions vary by basin just gives you a huge amount to really assess sort of how the company is doing on addressing emissions. So would just really encourage folks to take advantage of that. That being said, let's see. We've got a question. I'll start with one of the ones from the chat here. So yeah, this is something I know that we've talked about quite a bit, we being the sort of the groups behind this report. So the question of sort of this report really being focused on the upstream, and whether we're considering the future expanding this to include midstream operators, given that some recent research has really suggested that there's quite a bit of emissions coming from that part of the value chain. So I don't know, Luke or Leslie, you can both maybe weigh in on the broad question of the role of midstream, but then maybe the specific question of this analysis and kind of where one can get data to look at that.
Sure. So midstream is a complicated segment to incorporate into an analysis like this, largely because of some data gaps, and some confidential data associated with some of the transmission segments. There is one potential expansion that is the production and gathering boosting segments that maybe is getting a little closer to midstream, but not maybe quite, where there is some overlap between how companies define production equipment and assets and gathering and boosting assets. Some companies qualify assets as production, whereas other companies may qualify those same assets as gathering and boosting. And the data are there to enable a similar type of an analysis, but there would probably be some things we would have to figure out to make it really consistent with this methodology.
And I would just add that, as you probably already know, the waste emission charge will apply to all will apply to the midstream segment as well. So nearly all the data that's being reported as subpart W, not just production. So going forward, especially if we're trying to understand the impact that these emissions have on the charge that companies will have to pay, it will be something that we'll hopefully be able to take a look at in the future. As Luke said, there are challenges with looking at that data, but it's going to become even more relevant. And sorry, yeah, I think that's all on that.
Yeah, no, I just would add, I mean, I think we're well aware of the importance of kind of, broadening out the scope here a bit. It's just there are challenges around resources and time, but we're eager to kind of crack that nut in the future. Next question I'll highlight from the chat here is basically, there's been a lot of interest, obviously, in sort of the carbon content, the methane kind of, content of LNG. So the question is really around whether this tool or the EPA data gives you any insight into the kind of the supply chain for LNG and the methane content there. So I don't know, Leslie, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So as we said, this report only looks at the emissions from the production segment, so it doesn't follow that gas all the way through the midstream and all the way to the LNG plant. But if you are looking at LNG cargoes and where where they're sourcing their gas, you can trace that back and at least have a sense of what the emissions are associated with the production of that gas. And a lot of times, there you might have a sense of where the LNG company is sourcing their gas. So that is something you could dig into and use this data to understand the emissions.
And I would maybe add that even though I agree with that completely, an additional data source that might be helpful for trying to estimate the emissions profile of LNG and upstream emissions of LNG would be NETL, National Energy Technology Laboratory, LCA studies on the natural gas supply chain that use GHGRP data to create kind of production through delivery and distribution of natural gas and emission factors associated with that.
Great. Next question I would kind of raise up here is around, I mean, Leslie, you mentioned, I think, just, the sometimes significant differences in emissions intensity from basin to basin. So this person is asking basically, does that apply on a company basis too? Like, when you look at companies that have production across different basins, do you see real variation there, even within the same kind of corporate umbrella? And if so, do you have any thoughts on kind of what would drive that?
That's a good question. I think the answer is definitely yes. In the same companies operating in different basins, you can see very different emissions profiles and emission intensities. And if you look at the dashboards that Luke was showing, I think you'll be able to see that. I can't think of any specific example. So what's driving those differences? Some of them have to do with the geology of the basin, whether it's a oil heavy basin or a primarily dry gas basin. It also has to do with the legacy of those production wells. Did the company drill and develop those wells on its own, or did it acquire them through an acquisition? Sometimes that will have an impact on the types of equipment that are at those sites and the emissions profiles. So there's a lot of different factors that can drive those differences.
Yeah, and a really interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, but just, I mean, you can even look like at the Permian, right? The Permian straddles two states, right? There's significant production in New Mexico, also obviously in Texas, very different regulatory regimes around methane in those two states. And certainly plenty of operators operate on both sides. So it would be interesting to go into the tool and kind of look at whether a single operator takes a different approach in New Mexico versus Texas. One would hope not, but
unfortunately, in the tool, they're reporting total emissions for the whole Permian. It's not separated by state, so you won't be able to see that directly. But in this tool, unfortunately, it would be great to be able to see that. But you're right, the different regulatory environments in different states are definitely playing a role.
Great. And then the next question is, we can even broaden it out. It's about whether we were to, consider expanding the universe to include kind of Canadian midstream, for example. But I guess maybe that would be helpful to kind of hear, but also maybe just the broader question of, the US, this is kind of US upstream onshore data. Other geographies where there is this sort of information being collected that somebody could analyze. Obviously, with satellites and such coming, there may be more data in the future, but is there regulatory data elsewhere that one could tap into?
Yeah, that I can jump in. That's a good question. I mean, I know that Canada does have a greenhouse gas reporting program, but as far as I understand, it's not nearly as granular or detailed data as what we have in the US greenhouse gas reporting program. So you wouldn't be able to do this sort of deep dive analysis, and also the methodology for that program is likely quite different. So it would be hard to compare apples to apples. So yeah, I think it would be hard to compare across countries. But like you said, Andrew, I think as we get more and more measurement data and satellite and other aerial measurements, that that data is getting better and better. I think we're not quite there yet in order to be able to compare companies. But in the next few years, hopefully we'll be able to do that more.
Great. One thing we haven't really gotten into yet is just the question of like the limits of this data, but also the value of this data. I mean, I think a lot of people who are maybe less deep in the weeds on methane emissions reporting maybe have some sense that the EPA data is sort of limited or underreports. I wonder if, I don't know, maybe this is a question, Luke, for you, is from a methodological standpoint, like what do you see this data being particularly useful for? And I guess what caveats should people keep in mind when they look at the data in terms of comparing companies?
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely speak to the value of it, and I think Leslie might be a little bit more familiar with some of the gaps. But the value of it, actually, you building off of what Leslie was just saying with the methodology differences between Canadian data and the US data, the fact that this data set is applicable to all of these companies and is kind of requires all of these companies to utilize the exact same methodology, creates this very comprehensive, albeit there are some issues with it, but everyone's starting with the same framework, using the same emission factors, developing their inventory the exact same way. And so even though the magnitude of numbers might be problematic to some degree, the relative magnitude across companies is the value. So it enables the actual apples to apples comparison of companies. And so even if, again, these actual high level emissions numbers aren't necessarily perfectly accurate, it does generally reflect the relative emissions profiles of companies against each other quite well, or at least we like to think so, because they are starting with the same framework and applying the exact same methodology to calculate those emissions. So from a benchmarking perspective, it's kind of exactly what is needed. From a accurate emissions inventory, that's where the gaps that it currently has, some of the archaic emission factors might impact that, but maybe I can let Leslie speak to those a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, the EPA has recently finalized some updates to the reporting requirements for the greenhouse gas reporting program for the oil and gas sector. And one really important part of that is the inclusion of a new source category for large release events. So it's not perfect. It's not going to it may not fully close the gap between reported and measured emissions, but there will at least be a source category for if a group observes a large emission event coming from a company, There'll be a mechanism for EPA to check that data, and then if it's an accurate measurement, the company will need to include those emissions in their reports for the greenhouse gas reporting program. So that's a huge step forward, because up until now, those emissions have not been included in this data set. There's also a lot of other, methodological improvements and updates that have been made. Many of those are moving in the direction of moving away from simply requiring companies to use emission factors and giving companies options to do source level measurements and include those measurements as part of as what they're reporting to EPA. That's a huge step forward, although it's moving away from this purely apples to apples comparison. And if each company is doing their own measurements and using their own sort of unique emission factors. So it's, a step forward, but is also a lot of need for EPA to audit and do some quality assurance of the data the companies will be submitting as part of those new reporting requirements, to make sure that the public can trust that data that will be submitted. But hopefully, assuming that all those audits are in place, it's going to do a lot to improve the quality of the data.
Great. Thanks to you both for that. I think we probably should wrap here, unfortunately. Just we're kind of up against the top of the hour, and I want to just make sure to cover kind of the last logistics so people know where to access kind of the slide deck and everything after we get off today. So you will all be getting a sort of a post-event email and sending you to a page that will have slides, the recording of the webinar, linked to the online data tool that Luke took us through, and to the report itself. So would encourage you all to look for that when it comes in the coming days. I mean, maybe just to wrap up. I mean, as you heard from Luke and Leslie today, we're at a really interesting moment in efforts to address methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. We have the methane fees coming soon, the EPA regulations coming a few years after that. There's tremendous work underway to move the industry from an estimation, an emissions factor approach to one that includes more direct measurement. We've got methane sat in the sky, and we'll, that'll be putting out data, I think later this year. So, there's going to be a lot more data coming out. And yet, we're still at a place in a moment where there's a massive performance gap across the industry that really needs to be closed. And given how critical methane is, there was a really powerful report the IEA put out earlier this year that essentially concluded that the world cannot achieve a 1.5-degree pathway without really ambitious progress on oil and gas industry methane emissions. We really don't have time to wait for regulations to take effect. We have to continue to move forward in the interim. So want to just wrap up by thanking our speakers for sharing your expertise, your insights. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. So with that, I will wrap us up. I will just say, yes, please send us your feedback on the webinar, on the report. There's a QR code here that you can use to do that. And then finally, Ceres has a number of events coming up over the coming months that we can kind of quickly just spin through here in the slide deck. They'll also be in the slides that you get. But we have our Freedom to Invest campaign, Climate Week coming up in September with a number of events on methane, on national oil companies, on other kind of investor climate work. And then we have the Ceres 35th anniversary gala coming up in New York at the end of October. So encourage you to check all of that out on our website. And with that, I think we will bring this to a close. So thank you everyone very much.